Welcome to the History and Heritage podcast with me, Liam Blake. Join me as we uncover hidden stories and insights that shaped our world. From mysteries to legacies, join us on this journey through time. You will have seen by the title of this video that this is going to be part of a series, and that 5-part series is on the Russian Revolution. So what exactly was the revolution? Why did it start? And how did it start? Well, lucky for you, that is exactly what this episode is going to be all about. We'll begin in the late 19th century, really getting into the social and economic fabric of that time, then we'll move forward little by little right to the doorstep of the February Revolution, which was 1917, which is when it really all kicked off and when the, you could say, Russian Revolution proper kicked off. But you might ask, why bother back in the late 19th century when it was 1917 the Russian Revolution was? But it's just so important to understand the complex situation of Russia at the time, all the little intricacies, the way that Russia was governed, the place it was in the world at the time, which is slightly different to the way it is now, or quite different actually. And it's like understanding anything in school. You have to understand why you want to understand it first. That is the reason, but you also need to understand the background to everything before you understand the main picture. That is exactly what I'm hoping to do with this podcast series, where I'll explore everything from repression, inequality, war, and the rise of revolutionary ideologies. That is right, 2 ideologies at least. So get ready, and let's dive right into it. So to start off, let's paint a detailed picture of Russia in the late 1800s. Imagine a vast empire, but one facing significant internal challenges rather than even external challenges. Russia was predominantly an agrarian or agricultural society. More specifically, over 80% of the population were peasants and most of them were farmers. This massive agricultural workforce shaped everything, literally everything, about Russian life at the time. Serfdom, which was one of those Middle Ages systems where, you had royalty, clergy and serfs. Serfdom had been abolished in 1861, so I said it was a Middle Ages policy, but it took up until 1861 for it to be properly abolished. But the reality at the time for the peasants of Russia was that it was still life of hardship and limited opportunity. While technically free, the peasants didn't receive any land outright. They were required to purchase it, and the people of the ruling classes were basically allowed to set whatever price they wanted, which let them set as high prices as they would like. A system called redemption payments meant peasants at the time were heavily indebted to the state for decades, limiting their economic freedom, which basically meant that in exchange for their freedom, the peasants were constantly indebted to the state and to the Tsar or king at the time. The peasant commune, also known as the mer, played a significant role. While it offered some security, it also restricted the individual initiative and innovation of farming. You weren't essentially allowed to farm whatever you wanted. You were told, right, you're living here, so you have to farm the way we want you to farm. Traditional farming methods, the old horse and cart and plough, remained widespread, resulting in low agricultural productivity and contributing to basically economic stagnation. So, as I said, Russia was back in the Middle Ages, essentially, all the way up until 1861. And I know to some people 1861 seems a long time ago now, but it really isn't. However, industrialization was beginning at that point, so in around the 1860s, 1870s, but it was really, really slow and way slower than most of Western Europe. Factories were emerging in major cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, attracting peasants and seeking work, which is why those cities, even up to today, have such big populations, because the peasants decided, I'm just going to get out of here and work in factories. But as you would have noticed, I only mentioned St. Petersburg and Moscow, and industrial development was concentrated in a very few areas, leaving much of the country untouched, which would have sent those areas into even worse economic decline than they were already in. Now you might think, oh yeah, factory work, that's grand, but the conditions were really just appallingly awful. Long hours, low wages and dangerous environments, which is a detailed look. It would be very similar but even worse than, let's say, the start of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which a lot of my Irish listeners will be familiar with. But up until the 1860s, pretty much, there was, as I said, nobility, clergy, and farmers, or serfs. But now there was a new industrial class, known as the proletariat, and they were increasingly unhappy with their standard of living, the way they had to work such long hours and in such dangerous conditions, and basically just everything. This, if you know anything about other revolutions, was ripe for starting a revolution, and that is exactly what happened. Russia also at the time was heavily reliant on foreign investment and expertise to drive its industrial growth. That is kind of similar to Ireland now, where everyone's kind of in a sweat because they're wondering whether the President of the United States will pull all the United States people out of Ireland. Its infrastructure, particularly its transportation network, was underdeveloped, hindering economic progress. Tsar Alexander II, he's not a massive figure, but he's quite a big figure in this whole story. And he, in the 1860s, prior to the 1860s, he was the one who set the serfs free and stopped serfdom in Russia. And he made some small reforms in the 1860s and 70s aiming to modernize Russia. But these included creation of councils called zemstvos, which were essentially county councils, with some responsibility for local affairs like education and healthcare in local areas. And he also reformed the legal system, including the establishment of trial by jury, which hadn't been at all the case up until that time. He also tried to modernise the army and improve its effectiveness. However, these reforms were often limited in scope and faced resistance from conservative elements within government and its aristocracy. And as I said, resistance sometimes and always at some point will take military form or violent form. And in 1881, Alexander II was killed. This marked a massive turning point at the time and led to a period of reaction and curtailed reforms under his successor Alexander III. Alexander III strengthened the autocratic powers of the Tsar and cracked down on dissent. Basically, he didn't want to get killed the way his father did. A policy of what they called Russification or severe Russian nationalism was implemented, aiming to impose a Russian language and culture on non-Russian ethnic groups within the empire. This is still going on in certain areas of Western Europe, particularly today, or Eastern Europe, particularly today, and is the cause of much discontent. As with all leaders who were kind of scared of a backlash or getting shot themselves, censorship was tightened, and the Okhrana, the secret police, increased their surveillance and repressive activities. And in case you don't know, by World War II, secret police were never good. Alexander III also massively persecuted minority groups, particularly Jews, at this time. It's always the Jews that get persecuted. Oh well. Ironically enough, though, this period of repression fueled the growth of revolutionary movements, as individuals and groups sought more radical solutions to Russia's problems. Various socialist and anarchist groups emerged, attracting intellectuals, workers, and peasants. These groups employed tactics such as propaganda, agitation, and in some cases terrorism to advance their cause. Speaking of one of these groups, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, RSDLP, was set up in 1898. The RSDLP was founded at a secret conference in Minsk, which would have at the time been highlighting the risks involved in organising such a political party under the Tsarist regime. Its primary aim was to unite the various revolutionary groups operating in Russia under a single cohesive banner, increasing their collective strength and effectiveness. Prior to the RSDLP, numerous socialist and Marxist groups existed in Russia, often operating independently. The RSDLP sought to bring these groups together under a unified ideology and organisational structure. The party's foundation was rooted in Marxist principles. The key Marxist concepts would have been class struggle, historical materialism, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. These ideas were applied to the specific context of Russia by the RSDLP, analysing its social and economic structure through a Marxist lens. The RSDLP focused primarily on the industrial working class, or, as I've said multiple times now, the proletariat. This focus stemmed from the Marxist belief that the proletariat was the most revolutionary class in capitalist society. The party aimed to organise workers, raise their class consciousness and prepare them for revolution, essentially. However, this focus was somewhat paradoxical, given that Russia's economy was still overwhelmingly agrarian at the time. I've said that, there was somewhat of a minor industrial revolution at the time, but still it was 70 to 80% agricultural. So why were they trying to organise just the working class? But anyways, we'll leave that to the RSDLP because the Russian Revolution happened, so they must have got something right. The Marxist theory generally viewed the peasantry as a less reliable revolutionary force than the proletariat, and there is your answer. The RSDLP believed that industrialisation would eventually lead to the growth of the proletariat and the decline of the peasantry, making the working class key to the revolution. It operated illegally, facing constant surveillance from the Okhrana, arrest and even exile. There was a lot of them that were exiled. If you were found to be part of the RSDLP, you risked imprisonment, forced labour, or even death for any activities associated with what they would have called at the time anti-Tsarist beliefs. The party relied, therefore, obviously enough, on underground networks, secret meetings, clandestine printing presses, and couriers. Key figures with the RSDLP, keep these names very much in mind: Vladimir Lenin, Georgy Plekhanov, and Yuliy Smartov, particularly the first and the last one. Georgy Plekhanov to a lesser extent, but Vladimir Lenin and Yuliy Smartov. Vladimir Lenin, whose real name was Vladimir Ulyanov, was a fervent revolutionary and key figure in the development of what became known as Bolshevik ideology. Georgy was an influential Marxist theorist, often considered to be the father of Russian Marxism, and played a significant role in shaping Lenin's early thinking. Yuliy Smartov was a prominent Menshevik leader, advocating for a more moderate and democratic approach to socialism. Lenin famously stated in 1902, "It is necessary to prepare men who devote to the revolution not only their free evenings, but their entire lives." And outside of revolutionary, ideals or whatever, I think in general life, that is what people should strive for, but that's, again, personal thing. Anyways, he argued that a disciplined and centralised party was essential for leading the working class to revolution. The RSDLP faced internal debates over strategies and tactics. A central debate revolved around the role of the working class versus the peasantry in the revolution. The Narodniks, or populists, had traditionally emphasised the role of the peasantry as the main revolutionary force of Russia. However, the RSDLP rejected this view, arguing that the proletariat was the key to socialist revolution. Another key issue was whether Russia could skip the capitalist stage of development. Orthodox Marxism held that capitalism was a necessary stage in historical development, creating the conditions for socialism. However, some argued that Russia could potentially bypass capitalism due to its unique social and economic conditions. So that's 1902 out of the way, and now 1903. The year 1903 marked a critical turning point for the RCLP as the party experienced a major split at its second Congress, which for some strange reason was held in London. I suppose it was because all of them were exiled from Russia at this point, but I thought it would be at least what we now call Eastern Europe. The split occurred over a seemingly minor disagreement concerning the definition of a party membership, but it reflected deeper ideological and strategic differences. Lenin wanted a strict and exclusive definition of party membership, arguing that only those actively participating in a party organisation should be considered full members. However, Martov championed a more lenient and inclusive definition, suggesting that sympathisers and supporters of the party should also be granted membership status. Or status, depending on how you pronounce that word. This seemingly small disagreement led to the formation of two distinct factions within the RSDLP: the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, and the Mensheviks, led by Martov. The term Bolshevik and Menshevik mean majority and minority in Russian, respectively. These terms arose from a vote during the Second Congress, although the actual strength of the two factions fluctuated over time. The Bolsheviks favoured a highly disciplined, centralised party structure. They believed that a small group of professional revolutionaries should lead the working class. They emphasized the importance of a centralized control and strict adherence to party doctrine. They believed that workers and peasants, guided by the vanguard party, could carry out the revolution. They argued that Russia could potentially skip the capitalist stage of development and transition directly to socialism. The Mensheviks preferred a broader, more inclusive party structure. They advocated for mass participation and democratic decision-making within the party. They were more willing to cooperate with other political groups, including liberals. They sought alliances with liberal elements for a bourgeois democratic revolution. They believed that Russia needed to go through a democratic phase before a socialist revolution could be possible. These differences would profoundly shape future events. The Bolsheviks eventually seized power in the October Revolution of 1917, which we'll get to later. The Mensheviks played a key role in the provisional government after the February Revolution, but were gradually marginalized. Lenin then, in 1902, wrote a very important paper, and he called it, well, the English translation of what he called it is What is to be Done. It argued that the working class on its own could only develop trade union consciousness, not revolutionary consciousness. Therefore, a professional revolutionary organisation was needed to bring socialist ideas to the workers. A fellow by the name of Leon Trotsky, who you might know if you know things about literature, initially sided with the Mensheviks but later developed his own position. He disagreed with Lenin's emphasis on a highly centralized party structure, and his theory of permanent revolution would influence later events. Trotsky argued that the bourgeois and socialist revolutions could be fused together in Russia, and he believed that the revolution should not stop at the establishment of a democratic republic, but should continue until socialism was achieved. And we'll skip another 2 years to the first of the revolutions, 1905. The 1905 revolution marked a turning point in Russian history, serving as a prelude to the more dramatic events which we'll get to much later in the series of 1917. The revolution began on the 22nd of January 1905 with Bloody Sunday, in which a peaceful procession of workers led by a priest called Father Gapon marched to the Winter's Palace in St. Petersburg to petition the Tsar for better conditions. However, the protesters were unarmed and carried religious icons and portraits of the Tsar, but the peaceful protesters were fired upon outside the Winter Palace by royal forces. The Tsarist troops opened fire on the crowd, killing and wounding hundreds of people, and the exact number of casualties is disputed depending on what historian you go to, but estimates range from several hundred to over 1,000. And as you would expect, this sparked widespread demonstrations and strikes across Russia. News of the massacre spread quickly, igniting outrage and anger throughout the country. Workers, students and intellectuals took to the streets to protest the government's actions. So after this, one of the key developments, and what ended up being a key development for the revolution in 1917, was the formation of the St. Petersburg Soviet, a workers' council. This Soviet emerged spontaneously as a coordinating body for striking workers in St. Petersburg. It was composed of elected delegates from factories and workshops throughout the cities. And Leon Trotsky, fellow I mentioned briefly earlier, emerged as a big leader of this particular St. Petersburg Soviet. His leadership in the 1905 revolution enhanced his reputation as a revolutionary figure. Peasants, inspired by the events of the cities, began to seize land from landlords in the countryside, and they formed peasant committees to redistribute lands and challenge the authority of the government. Even in the military, the revolution of 1905 had its effects, with sailors on the ship the Potemkin mutinying against their officers due to poor living conditions and mistreatment. And this mutiny also spread to other ships in the Black Sea Fleet, but they weren't as successful and are nowhere near as well known. So, still in 1905, skip forward to October 17th, where Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto promising reforms. He reluctantly agreed to make concessions, but he managed to pull the best political stroke of the time, where those concessions weren't really concessions, which I'll get to in a second. The chief advisor was the guy who actually wrote the manifesto at the time, and his name was Sergei Witte. The concessions, or parts of the manifesto that were the concessions, included the creation of the State Duma, which was Russia's first parliament. It was to be an elected legislative body with the power to approve laws. And the October Manifesto also promised basic civil liberties such as freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. They still weren't happy though, and in December 1905 there was a short and small uprising, but it was violently suppressed. And at this, radical elements within the revolutionary movement, dissatisfied with the limited nature of the October Manifesto, launched an uprising. The government responded with brutal force, crushing the uprising and arresting its leaders. Trotsky later said, although with a few broken ribs, Tsarism came out of 1905 alive and strong. He also noted the events of 1905 were a prologue to the two revolutions of 1917. In 1906, the first State Duma was established but quickly was dissolved. It was dissolved by the Tsar after it began to challenge his authority and demand more radical reforms. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin initiated agricultural reforms from 1906 to 1911. Stolypin aimed to modernize Russian agriculture and create a more stable and prosperous peasantry. These aimed to create a class of conservative farmers loyal to the Tsar. He believed that private land ownership would incentivize peasants to work harder and be more productive, and he encouraged peasants to leave communes and establish private farms. His famous quote was, "We bet on the strong and sober," which reflects his belief that most hard-working and capable peasants should be given the opportunity to succeed. However, there is a bad side to everyone, and Stolypin used martial law and field court-martials to suppress revolutionary activity, and thousands of people were executed during his tenure, earning him the reputation for ruthlessness. And it was during this period, even more than previously, that revolutionary parties were driven into underground exile. Prince Skurbatov, at the time, who was a government minister, said, "The government enjoys the confidence neither of the sovereign, nor the army, nor the towns, nor the zemstvos, nor the nobility, nor the merchants, nor the working man." And then we get to 1914, July the 1st, when Russia entered World War I. Russia's entry into the war was motivated by its alliance with Serbia and its desire to maintain influence in the Balkans. The outbreak of the war was greeted with enthusiasm by many Russians who believed it would strengthen national unity and prestige. But however, one of the problems was it exposed the Tsar's incompetence and backwardness, including a series of humiliating defeats in the early years of the war. And also, I was telling you that the Russian economy was becoming more industrial. However, Russian factories by this stage were unable to produce enough weapons, ammunition, and other supplies to meet the needs of the armies. And the transportation infrastructure was also inadequate, hindering the movements of troops and supplies to the front. And this led to soldiers often lacking many of the basic equipments, such as rifles and boots. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas took personal command of the army because he believed that his personal leadership would inspire the troops and turn the tide of war. However, his lack of military experience and competence made it even worse. With the Tsar away at the front, the government in St. Petersburg, which was at the time called Petrograd, was left in the hands of Tsarina Alexandra and her advisors, including a priest by the name of Grigory Rasputin. By 1917, so when the Russian Revolution proper started, about 3 million casualties had occurred, and there were severe food shortages and inflation in Russia itself, which led to widespread hunger, which led to widespread discontent. And again, by the fact that the industries were overworked, industrial unrest grew, with strikes increasing in both frequency and size. And revolutionary agitators had a field day essentially and played a key role in organising and mobilising the workers. Peasant soldiers began to actually desert the army, often taking their weapons with them because they just had enough of this, what they thought of as a useless fight. General Brusilov, who was one of the biggest generals in Russia at the time, observed, "In a year of war, the regular army had vanished. It was replaced by an army of ignoramuses." A Russian officer was heard to remark at one point, "This is not war, sir, this is slaughter. The Germans use up shells, we use up human lives." By 1917, Russia faced a volatile mix of problems, creating a highly unstable situation. Extreme wealth inequality and poor working conditions were rampant. A small elite controlled vast wealth, while the majority of the populations lived in absolute poverty. Factory workers faced long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions. Rapid industrialization was creating a new urban working class. An unaddressed peasant's desire for land remained the source of much tension. Ultimately, the Tsarist regime's inability to adapt and address those interconnected crises created a pressure cooker environment, setting the stage for dramatic events we'll explore next time, where we'll witness the collapse of an empire and the dawn of a new era. Hey, just before you go, please like this podcast, rate it 5 stars if you can, and then also comment if you can, something nice or any advice you have, and share this with anyone you think might be interested in either history or heritage. And it's not just Irish focus, it's international focus as well. So, thank you.